Tonight at 10, the Home Secretary announces an independent inquiry into the murder of Sarah Everard. Priti Patel said it would look at how Sarah's killer was allowed to serve as a Metropolitan Police officer despite concerns about his behaviour.
The public have a right to know what systematic failures enabled his continued employment as a police officer. We need answers as to why this was allowed to happen.
Also on the programme tonight, as the army steps in to help with fuel deliveries, the Prime Minister insists there's no supply crisis and he's not worried.
What you can't do and must not do, Laura, is simply go back to the old, tired, failed model of the UK economy that has led to relative underproductivity by comparison with all our major competitors for decades and has held wages down.
A former Facebook employee turned whistleblower tells US lawmakers that the social media giant is harming children, stoking division and weakening democracy. At least 200,000 children in France were assaulted by priests and monks in the Catholic Church over the past 70 years, according to an inquiry that sent shockwaves through France. And a Russian actress and director arrive on board the International Space Station in a bid to beat the United States by filming the first movie in orbit.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, a tough night at the office for Arsenal as they came up against the holders Barcelona in the Women's Champions League.
Good evening. The Home Secretary has announced an independent inquiry into what she called the systematic failures that allowed a serving police officer to kidnap, rape and murder Sarah Everard. In her speech to the Conservative Party conference, Priti Patel said the public needs answers to ensure something like this can never happen again. Last week, Wayne Couzens was sentenced to a whole life term in prison. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning has this report.
So many questions after Sarah Everard's murder. How could Wayne Couzens be a police officer? Why wasn't he stopped earlier? Why are women still not safe? Nearly a week after we learnt the full distressing details of what a police officer did to Sarah Everard, there will now be a wide-ranging inquiry.
The public have a right to know what systematic failures enabled his continued employment as a police officer. We need answers as to why this was allowed to happen. I can confirm today that there will be an inquiry to give the independent oversight needed to ensure that something like this can never happen again.
The first part will look at Couzens, his previous behaviour and any opportunities missed to stop him. The second part will examine policing, looking at vetting how police investigate themselves and their behaviour. But the inquiry won't have the power to demand witnesses and evidence. But ministers promise that will change if needed.
It's not statutory, it's not judge-led, both of which we think it needs to be. And it can't just be about Wayne Couzens, it's got to be about the entire aspect of the case and also about women's treatment by the Met.
Brilliant, thank you. Hello, good morning.
Only yesterday, the Met Police Commissioner announced a review into her own force by an independent person working alongside her. There's also the police regulator investigation into whether the Met and Kent Police properly looked into 3 indecent exposure allegations against Couzens.
The Home Office can't say if any of the inquiry will be held in public, but the conclusions will be published. And just last month, the police inspectorate said there was an epidemic of violence against women and it needed to be treated as seriously as terrorism is. So it's not as if the government and the forces haven't been aware of many of these issues.
Tonight in Eastbourne, they held a vigil for Sabina Nessa, one of more than 80 women killed by men since Sarah Everard. But this morning, the Prime Minister refused to back calls for misogyny to be classified as a hate crime because he believes current laws are sufficient. This new inquiry must not just highlight the problems, but make the changes so that all women can be safe. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Boris Johnson has said he's not worried about rising prices and the disruption to food and some fuel supplies, saying the country can't go back to what he called the failed model of the UK economy. The Prime Minister said the government can't magic up solutions and argued supply chains would sort themselves out. He was speaking to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. Her report contains some flash photography.
This is fantastic.
He doesn't hide how much he's enjoying himself. Ahead in the polls, with the plump cushion of a huge majority back at Parliament. But carefree? The country is not. With rising prices, some empty shelves.
Prime Minister, why wasn't the government prepared for what you describe as very real stresses and strains on the country right now?
This is a function of a global recovery, and you're seeing stresses and strains caused by the world economy sucking in demand for everything from gas to HGV drivers across the planet. Rather than government stepping in to mend and patch and mend every bit of our supply chains, what you've got is, in this country, fantastic expertise, fantastic skill in logistics. You listen to some of the supermarkets, they will manage this.
But it's real-world problems that people are facing. You were warned back in April about the shortage of HGV drivers. You were warned about fuel costs back in July. There was a letter to you from the meat industry back in June. Isn't the point that you were warned about every single one of these issues, and you're basically still sitting saying, well, the government might be able to help around the edges, but basically business has got to sort it out?
Well, on all of those issues, and certainly there are issues in all of those sectors, but what you can't do and must not do, Laura, is simply go back to the old, tired, failed model of the UK economy that has led to relative underproductivity by comparison with all our major competitors for decades, and has held wages down. Government can't magic up changes to their systems overnight. British farmers.
Those farmers may have to cull healthy animals they can't process and sell. And drivers haven't been able to fill up at the pump. Yet the Prime Minister seems happy for the government to take a back seat.
People are experiencing real problems with all of these things, and it sounds like what you're basically saying is, it's not my problem.
In terms of the consumer, we're giving all the protections that we can. Some of the people who have been writing to me may be worried about this, but I'm not worried about this, because actually I think it will be good for their businesses to invest in people and to invest in capital.
So you're not worried about inflation?
I believe that supply will match demand, and that is what we want to encourage. What you've got to do as a government is look at the long term and look at how you can make the investments now that will bear down on costs. That's the way to deal with the cost of living, and fix this, and the supply chains will start to sort themselves out very, very rapidly.
For the Prime Minister, changing the economy is part of a deliberately different Tory look.
Afternoon, Carrie.
Hi.
You looking forward to conference?
Very much so, thank you.
Carrie Johnson striding in to take her own place on stage at an event supporting LGBT rights tonight.
Thank you.
But who's supporting her?
One last thing, a special guest coming to conference later. Are you looking forward to that?
I'm always looking forward to all guests coming to conference.
Well, your wife's coming to speak. Are you going to go and watch?
I'm sure it's going to be great.
He did find the time to fit it in, to be part of her crowd.
All the progress we have made as a society, we know there is still a long way to go.
But this week's a show of confidence from all of Team Johnson.
How did your speech go, Mrs. Johnson?
Good evening. Nice to see you.
Yet that could tip into complacency, a risk some Tories fear the Prime Minister is too ready to take. Tomorrow, a moment for his speech on the stage he's made his own. A time to explain what could be a turbulent next chapter to all of us. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Manchester.
Our business editor, Simon Jack, joins me now. How much tension is there between government and business right now?
There's a fair amount of finger-pointing in this blame game. I mean, Boris Johnson, you heard there, was saying that some of these issues are global. That's true about rising fuel and gas prices around the world. Some less true about HGV, poultry, agricultural workers, where we have a specific domestic problem here, which is worse than the EU average. But what he's saying is, to the extent we do have a domestic problem, it is the fault of business not to wean itself off a supply of EU workers who are the last people prepared to put up with some of the pay and conditions which have been created by a lack of business investment over the years. Now, business say, hang on a second, we've had a pandemic to deal with, we didn't know what the terms of the Brexit deal were going to be, and even some pro-Brexit businessmen like the next boss, Lord Wolfson, is saying these labour shortages are real, they're damaging, they're going to push prices up, and they can't be just sorted, they won't sort themselves out without some more government intervention. I think it's fair to say that the atmosphere between business and government is as wary and distrustful of each other as any I've seen in the last few years, and it's been a pretty fractious few years. At the end of the day, these problems of higher fuel prices, rising gas prices, some food shortages, whosever fault it is, they are everyone's problem. And business is saying it's going to take everyone to sort it out. That includes business and indeed government.
Simon Jack, thank you. A former Facebook employee turned whistleblower has told a US Senate committee today that she believes the company's products have harmed children, stoked division and weakened democracy. Frances Haugen told lawmakers the social media giant knew its apps were harming the mental health of some young users, but Facebook has insisted it prioritises safety over profit. Our Silicon Valley correspondent James Clayton has this report.
Eleanor and Freya are both 14, and like many teenagers, they're both on Instagram.
As a teenager, you're looking at these people, like all these models and, influencers, they all are very skinny and they have like a perfect body. And when you're looking at that and then kind of comparing yourself to it, it's like I think it could be really damaging.
When you're like feeling at your worst and then you go on Instagram and you see things that are like targeted at you because you've looked at these kinds of things before, you see them like models, influencers, celebrities, things like that, and you're just like, oh, well, I'll never be like that.
Eleanor and Freya's concerns are in fact shared by one rather important company, Facebook, which owns Instagram. In fact, leaked internal research found that teens who struggle with mental health say that Instagram makes it worse. The woman who leaked that report is called Frances Haugen, and today she gave evidence in Washington.
The documents I have provided to Congress prove that Facebook has repeatedly misled the public about what its own research reveals about the safety of children.
She also said that Facebook's motives were driven by money rather than the mental health of its users.
I saw Facebook repeatedly encounter conflicts between its own profits and our safety. Facebook consistently resolved these conflicts in favor of its own profits.
Here in Silicon Valley, Facebook has pushed back, saying that some of the research presented is misleading. And despite the fact that Instagram concluded that it could be damaging for children's mental health, it also says that it can have a positive impact. Reacting to Haugen's evidence this evening was Facebook's president of content policy, Monica Bickert.
And again, anytime a single teen is having a bad experience, that's too much. One thing that shows that we are prioritizing safety above profit is the very fact that we're asking these hard questions.
Facebook has said it's postponed a controversial project to create Instagram for kids. But we now know that some very important politicians in Washington believe the company has put profit over the mental health of teenage girls. James Clayton, BBC News, San Francisco.
Mandatory COVID passes for nightclubs and large events will be introduced in Wales after a knife-edge vote this evening in the Senedd. From the 11th of October, people will need to show evidence of being fully vaccinated or having a recent negative COVID test. Well, Hal Griffith is at the Senedd now, and this vote was incredibly tight, wasn't it?
Yeah, just 28 to 27, a sign of just how contentious this plan is. And even after the voting was done, Senedd members couldn't leave the Parliament buildings behind me because of all the protesters outside. Now, inside, the Welsh Labour government opponents all voted against, some claiming this would introduce a checkpoint society. Ethical questions then, but also ones about enforcement. Not least what would happen at a big sporting event like a rugby international with checks for 70,000 spectators. For its part, the Welsh Labour government insists passes have been used successfully over the summer at festivals, and they insist it's a COVID pass, not a vaccine passport, so you can get one even if you only have a negative lateral flow result. But with less than a week before this is introduced at venues up and down Wales, there are still some practical problems to overcome, not least that if you download a pass to your phone at the moment in Wales, the words that come up on the screen are valid in England.
Oh, thank you. Now let's take a look at the UK's latest coronavirus figures. The government data shows that there were 33,869 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. So just over 34,000 new cases were reported on average per day in the past week. 6,747 people were in hospital with COVID across the UK yesterday. There were 166 deaths, that's of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means on average 111 deaths were announced every day in the past week. The latest figures on people who have been vaccinated haven't yet been made available. Well, the number of pupils absent from state schools in England for COVID-related reasons rose by 2/3 at the end of last month. Latest figures from the Department for Education showed over 200,000 children were off school on the last day of September, but numbers are much lower than the end of last term, when bubble systems were still in place and more than 1 million children were absent. Our education correspondent Elaine Dunkley has been to a high school in West Yorkshire to see how they're coping with ongoing challenges posed by COVID.
Hi, it's Adele Webster, the Student Welfare Officer calling from Honley High School.
Another phone call to parents, another pupil with symptoms.
Complaint of headache and a cough, and it could possibly be COVID.
COVID is still causing disruption.
We need to just isolate from the other students, so if you just come up with me and we'll sit at the back of the hall, is that okay?
It's a busy week for Adele, the welfare officer.
If you can phone Dad for me.
Since the start of term, an increasing number of children are missing school.
Yesterday we sent 4 home. 2 of those have come back confirmed as positive. I'd say it's probably the busiest we've been in terms of cases in school.
We've spent a week at Honley High in West Yorkshire. Like other schools in England, restrictions have been lifted by the government.
It's been absolutely amazing to have what feels much more like a normal school again.
You all right, girls?
All of the children go into their lessons in their subject specialist teachers' rooms, science experiments happening, but at the same time we're dealing with, unfortunately, a rise in the number of cases.
He's tested positive for COVID now, so he's not back.
As of today, we've hit 200 with students and staff, which I think the highest number we had last year at any one time was 28 cases across the school.
Here, an old building makes ventilation an issue. A spike in cases means open evenings are now online. Assemblies are cancelled and the wearing of masks is being encouraged.
How have you been then? I haven't felt as bad as I thought I would be.
For pupils in school and at home, these are difficult times.
I think the hardest thing is not seeing everyone. I've been away from my family.
So what are you doing then? Do you just
I've been doing Teams from home. The teachers, they usually put PowerPoints on for what lessons we can do. So I've been just going through the PowerPoints by myself upstairs, and it's a bit lonely. Honestly, I'm so excited to come back.
Everyone's missing you, loads. Yeah, everyone's missing you.
Emily is in Year 11 and will be sitting her GCSE exams next summer.
It's a bit nerving for all the Year 11s, I think, because we've not only missed Year 10 of our learning of our GCSEs, we've also missed Year 9, which has been really disruptive.
Hiya, you're right. So just as we explained on the phone call...
Meanwhile, there's no let-up for the welfare officer.
Go and get him a PCR test.
This pupil is going home.
If they're negative, if he's feeling well, he can come back to school.
We have been doing the lateral flow tests and they've all come back negative, so... But in the meantime, I'm working from home, so it's all right for him to be at home with me.
Yeah, right, OK.
From tomorrow, the school is preparing to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds.
And it's very difficult to break that cycle.
The Department for Education says along with vaccinations, it's about managing the risks with ventilation and regular testing. But with just over 200,000 pupils absent in schools in England, COVID continues to keep children from the classroom. Elaine Dunkley, BBC News.
A report into sexual abuse by the French Catholic Church has estimated that more than 200,000 children were assaulted by clergy over the past 70 years. The independent commission said the Church had been guilty of negligence, failures and silence. The report has sent shockwaves through France, as our Paris correspondent Lucy Williamson reports.
70 years of horror, hundreds of thousands of victims, laid bare in one explosive report. Its language stark, its judgment grim. For a very long time, it says, the French Catholic Church showed complete, even cruel indifference to those who suffered abuse. The report estimates the number of child victims of sexual abuse at the hands of priests, deacons, monks or nuns at 216,000. If non-clergy are included, that figure rises to 330,000, a third of a million children.
Un ensemble de négligence.
There was, above all, a catalogue of negligence, failures, silence, an institutional cover-up which appeared systematic and on which the Commission came to an unanimous conclusion. The Church did not see, did not hear, did not know how to pick up weak signals.
The investigators analysed decades of church archives, court records and testimony from victims. Most abuses happened in the 1950s and 60s, too long ago for anyone to be prosecuted now. One of those who testified was this priest. He told the panel how, in the year he turned 18, during clerical training, he was repeatedly raped by a senior figure in the seminary.
It destroys people. There is the physical violence, but there is also a whole context of control, which destroys not only the body, but the heart and the mind. That's why these sexual assaults are so serious.
This report has shattered public perceptions and public trust in an institution that still has a strong presence in France. The sheer number of victims estimated by the inquiry has dwarfed previous scandals here and exploded the idea that they're just isolated events. At churches across France today, a test of faith as clergy and congregations absorb the news.
It's a catastrophe. It's a betrayal. There are predators everywhere.
I
was raised in a religious institution. Among 20 priests, there was one we were warned about. I think the report probably underestimates the number of victims.
At many services today, priests spoke about the challenges laid out by the inquiry. This dark corner of church history makes painful reading, but the report is also, for many, a light at the end of a very long road. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
A panel has called for a public inquiry to be held into institutions for unmarried mothers in Northern Ireland. The devolved government committed to an investigation after research into mother and baby homes was published. Women said they were detained against their will, used as unpaid labour and had to give up babies for adoption. The inquests have opened into the deaths of 4 young gay men who were all murdered by the serial killer Stephen Port. The jury was told the inquests will focus on whether police missed opportunities to stop him sooner. The victims were all given fatal overdoses of the drug GHB by Port, who was jailed for life in 2016. Since the start of the pandemic, almost 6 million people on universal credit have had an extra £20 a week to help some of the poorest families in the UK. But it comes to an end tomorrow. The government says it was always a temporary measure and the focus now should be on making sure work pays with higher wages rather than higher benefits. From Londonderry, our social affairs correspondent Michael Buchanan has been speaking to some people affected by the change.
In one of the UK's most deprived areas, any job is a good job. Laura McShane works full-time as an admin assistant at an advice centre in Londonderry. Her husband also works full-time, but as both are on low wages, they started claiming universal credit at the start of the pandemic. As such, Laura didn't realise her benefit payment included the £20 a week uplift.
Well, our first payment, we got enough to help us pay at least half of our rent, and another half came out of our wages, but we thought that was fine, it was more than manageable. So we were counting on this is what we get every single week. And then we got a message saying, we're taking this money off you as of this date, and we were just lost.
The UK government say the extra money was always meant to be temporary, and that with the economy reopening, there are jobs to be had, with vacancies plentiful.
You're going to the youth club at 2:30.
For Deirdre McCausland, childcare is a significant barrier to work, however. The former teacher, a single mother, can't find a job that works around her son's school hours.
I hate to say it, because I was one of the people in my local Asda when I was teaching in England, and there was a big crate, and you put it in, food bank crate, and I never knew where it went. I'm now one of the people who will be using food banks.
at the Women's Centre Derry an experiment to show how much £20 can buy. They did an online shop and managed to buy all this: breakfast, lunch and dinner for a few days.
£20 means the difference between somebody eating and not eating. £20 meant the difference that a woman had the dignity of being able to feed her family and do it in a nutritional way and not feel less than. That's what that £20 means to me.
Maintaining the extra £20 a week would cost £6 billion, a figure ministers say is unsustainable. Instead, they've set aside £500 million to help the most vulnerable and want businesses to increase wages, as some already have. Other employers, however, can't afford pay rises, and if you love your job, choices are limited.
So what are your options then in terms of making up that shortfall?
Absolutely nothing. I'm already full-time at my job. My husband's already full-time at his job. There's nothing else we can do. We are just going without that money.
So what are you going to do?
Pray.
Laura McShane ending that report. Now, Yulia Peresild is a Russian actress who has starred in dozens of films, but her next one should make history. She has become the first actor to go to space to star in a film. She and her director have just arrived on board the International Space Station at the start of a 12-day mission. They'll film scenes for their movie The Challenge, about a doctor going to space to help an astronaut. And their mission? To beat a similar Hollywood project planned by Tom Cruise and NASA, as Richard Galpin reports.
Arriving in the International Space Station earlier today, a very unusual team of cosmonauts.
Russian actress Yulia Peresild and her producer-director Klim Shipenko. Liftoff of Soyuz MS-19.
They'd blasted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan earlier today on a unique mission: to become the first to make a feature film in space. The film's called The Challenge, about an emergency inside the International Space Station. The actor and director both had what was described as a crash course in space travel before heading off.
We have been working really hard. Although we look all happy and smiles, we are very tired. It's been very difficult, both mentally and physically.
But the Russians have beaten the Americans, who wanted to make a film in space with Tom Cruise. They're now spending 12 days flying above the Earth, making their film. Richard Galpin, BBC News, Moscow.
And that's it from us now on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Good night.